Greetings, everyone, to those of you who are joining us in person and those of you who are watching this as a recording at a future time. I'm glad to welcome you on this day commemorating Indigenous peoples, the First Nations in the past and in the present, on whose lands we live here in the United States of America. Thinking of the power of the past to act in the present is particularly suitable for today's topic, the Hagia Sophia. In a world which is by and large unfamiliar with the term Byzantine, this monument has become a powerful symbol of nationalist Islam warring with those of us who believe in a shared global heritage. As many of you have heard me say in the past, monuments are not neutral fossils of past moments, but are active players in history and in the present. The study of art history is central to our human project, namely civilization. Art historians do not live in ivory towers, but grapple with the most powerful issues of our time. The Hagia Sophia is one great example, but the monuments to the white male Confederate past that have been toppling down in our country for the last couple of years now are another powerful instance of the agency of art. Alexandra Kaczynski will be introducing our speaker today, Professor Robert Ousterhout, with a focus on his scholarly contributions to the world. I would like to begin with a few more personal comments. Bob and I became friends after he moved to Philadelphia, now many years ago. We had had a very friendly and collegial community of Byzantinists in the area, with Dale Kinney and Alicia Walker at Bryn Mawr, me at Temple, and our colleague teaching in an associated field, Larry Neese at Delaware. We shared students and we also hosted lectures. But when Bob arrived, Byzantine studies took on a much higher profile. I became accustomed to numerous distinguished speakers and entire conferences being held at Penn on a regular basis. When Bob went to Dumbarton Oaks for a sabbatical year, I finally realized I felt as if the party had left Philadelphia and moved to Washington with him, and I was despondent. The point I'm trying to make here is that Bob is not only an extraordinary scholar and teacher, he is also someone who brings people together and who makes great things happen. We had hoped to host him last spring in person here in Cleveland, but are grateful to Zoom technology that enables us to host him virtually. So welcome to Cleveland, Bob, via Zoom, and let's hope that you'll be able to come in the flesh in a year's time when Case Western Reserve University will be hosting the Byzantine Studies Conference of North America, almost exactly a year to this day. You'll be pleased to learn that Bob has also agreed to have this lecture recorded. It will be posted on his webpage at Penn at the University of Pennsylvania, and also on the Case Western Reserve University YouTube channel. I will now turn things over to one of our advanced doctoral candidates, Alexandra Kaczynski. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bowman, and good evening, everyone. Many thanks for joining us for the Julius Fund Lecture in Byzantine Art, sponsored by the Art History Department at Case Western Reserve University. It is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Robert Ousterhout, Professor Emeritus of Art History and Art at the University of Pennsylvania. Truly, as one of the foremost scholars of Byzantine art and architecture, Dr. Ousterhout needs no introduction. His publications, awards, and contributions to the field are so numerous that a brief summary of his recent accomplishments will have to suffice. Dr. Ousterhout has served as the president of the U.S. National Committee for Byzantine Studies, the president of Byzantine Studies Association of North America, and the director of the Center of Ancient Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Additionally, he has been on the boards of the Byzantine Studies Association of North America, the International Center of Medieval Art, and Dumbarton Oaks. He has received multiple prestigious honors and grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Dumbarton Oaks, Hewlett, Cress, Delmont, World Monuments Fund, and UNESCO Turkey, just to name a few. Dr. Ousterhout has organized multiple symposia, workshops, and exhibitions with institutions including the Getty Foundation, the Penn Museum, and the Istanbul Para Museum. He has also supervised archaeological survey projects at some of the most important Byzantine sites in existence, including the Pantocrator Monastery and settlements in Cappadocia. He transformed a generation of young scholars with his summer classes in Cappadocia. Dr. Ousterhout's boundary-breaking work integrates Byzantine and Eastern Mediterranean architecture into a global medieval world. Nowhere else is this more evident than in his publications, from articles in Gesta and Dumbarton Oaks papers to book projects, including Architecture of the Sacred, Space, Ritual, and Experience from Classical Greece to Byzantium, published in 2012 and edited with Bona di Westcote, or Visualizing Community and Art, Material Culture and Settlement in Byzantine Cappadocia from 2017. He first gave us insight into Byzantine architecture with his magisterial Master Builders of Byzantium. And last year, his fabulous book, Eastern Medieval Architecture, The Building Traditions of Byzantium and Neighboring Lands, came out, published by Oxford University Press. This book has already engendered an entire session at the Byzantine Studies Conference in Madison, and it will have a transformative effect on our understanding of Byzantine architecture. No one is better suited than Dr. Robert Ousterhout to explain one of the wonders of the world, the Hagia Sophia. We are all extremely excited to have him here for his talk, Heaven on Earth, Justinian's Hagia Sophia. And just as a quick note, before I turn it over to our speaker, we will be asking you to submit questions to the Q&A field, which Dr. Bowman will moderate at the end of the lecture. And please enter any other technical questions into the separate chat field. So thank you so much, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Ousterhout.
Thank you so much. I see people clapping with the mute buttons on, so I guess that means that I'm reaching some audience somewhere. Really, it's a great honor to give the Julius lecture, and particularly to be invited by my old friend, Professor Bowman. So thank you and my other friends at Case Western Reserve University for this opportunity to speak. My original remit, as defined in January of this year, was to come to Cleveland in March to give a lecture about Justinian's Hagia Sophia. I must say, when the invitation was given, we were living in a kinder, gentler world. Then COVID happened. Then Hagia Sophia was reopened as a mosque. And this has put Hagia Sophia on the map in a way that it hasn't been for a while. But I have to say, Hagia Sophia has always attracted attention because of its scale, because of its originality of design. It is a building that has elicited numerous interpretations. It has been contested. It has been fought over. It has been converted from Orthodox Church to Roman Catholic Church to mosque and to museum. And most recently, in July of last summer, it was reopened as a mosque to much fanfare and much consternation around the world. But as we can see from its checkered history, it's been many things to many people. And it's a building that we have to understand in a very special way. Byzantine architecture is changed forever by the construction of Hagia Sophia. It is a building that was world famous already in the 6th century and remains so throughout the rest of its history. It is a building that we might regard as a building of world desire. This explains why the first official act of Mehmet the Conqueror was to convert it to a mosque, and why Ataturk, when Turkey was reformed as a secular republic, converted the building into a museum, that is, a repository of history for all mankind. Sadly, now functioning as a mosque, we can see the Great Byzantine pavement covered by lovely turquoise carpet, and the mosaics visible from ground level have been curtained off, including the image of the Mother of God and the apse, and the imperial images in the narthex of the church. Here you see Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his first lady at Hagia Sophia, and Erdogan leading prayers as the building was reopened as a mosque last summer. Now, I'm going to mention that aspect of the building only briefly, but I should point out to you the fact that there have been a variety of fora available online dealing with issues surrounding Hagia Sophia, its rich and complicated history, and issues surrounding its conversion to a mosque. So I point out to you recent discussions at Dumbarton Oaks, ongoing discussions at Stanford, and recent discussions at Cornell University. You can go back to the recording of this to copy the websites if you need to. So let's go back to my original remit, which was Justinian's Hagia Sophia. Why has this building become such a player in world politics? It is, in fact, because the building is what we might regard as a temple of the world's desire. There's something about its scale and originality of design that cries out for symbolic reading and that cries out for the uniqueness of the building on the world stage. Even today in Constantinople or Istanbul, as we see here, looking at the historic peninsula, Hagia Sophia still dominates the landscape. And what says something of its scale is the second largest of the Byzantine churches to survive in Istanbul is its neighbor Agia Irini right here, the Church of the Holy Peace, which, as you can see, is dwarfed by its neighbor Hagia Sophia. Now, Hagia Sophia, as we know it, was rebuilt between 532 and 536 under the patronage of the Emperor Justinian by architects Anthemius of Tralles and Isidorus of Miletus. It is a building that has no clear predecessors and is a building that is unique and original in its design. This is not a building that is practical in any way, shape, or form. No one who was trained in the practicalities of architecture would ever engage in something like this. Where Anthemius and Isidorus bore the title mechanikos, that is, they were architect engineers with theoretical background, thoroughly steeped in the principles of geometry and thoroughly steeped in Neoplatonic philosophy, both of which are clearly represented in the design of their building. They were both university professors, and to ask them to design the largest and most magnificent building in the world would be, well, maybe not quite a stretch to ask me to design something like that, but I sure couldn't do it. Nevertheless, this gives some sense of the great originality in the design of the building. Hagia Sophia is dedicated to a concept and not a person. There is not a female saint named Sophia behind the dedication of the building. It is dedicated to the concept of the holy wisdom of God. And that said, it is perhaps best to understand the building of Anthemius and Isidorus in conceptual terms. It's also important to situate the building within its historical position. Built in the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire at Constantinople in the early 6th century during the reign of Justinian, at a time when much of the western portion of the Roman Empire had fallen to migrating tribes from the north and the east who had moved in to the areas of Western Europe and taken over. Now, Justinian was a man who thought big, and he thought big about the Byzantine or late Roman Empire as well. And he set about to reconquer territories that had been lost to the Byzantine Empire. So much of his reign is punctuated by this attempt to reconstruct the great Roman Empire of the past. And we can understand in this way Justinian participating in what we might call a competitive discourse with the Roman imperial past. That is, setting himself up to be the equal of his predecessors, not just Constantine, the founder of Constantinople, but also with the great emperors of the 1st and 2nd centuries in Rome. And this is something that we can see play out in architectural terms. Now, here you see the famed mosaic so-called portraits of Justinian and Theodora from San Vitale and Ravenna, which I'm sure are familiar to all of you. And on the right, I show that illustration from National Geographic magazine that inspired my nascent Byzantine mind when I was a child, illustrating that famous event taking place during the Nika riots in 532, when the throne was challenged and Justinian came very close to being toppled from the throne as the rabble rioted, set fire to the city, and raised a rival emperor to challenge him. And according to one historical source, Justinian was on the verge of fleeing when his wife, Theodora, uttered the immortal words, "Purple makes a beautiful shroud," which is to say, it's better to die when you're at the top of your game than to live on in infamy. So I love this picture, Justinian the wimp cowering on the throne as imperious Theodora is there telling him what to do. It's very much of a historical fable, but what's important here is Justinian and Theodora were not from the old Roman aristocracy. They represented something new. They rose through their own abilities. Justinian had been born a peasant in the Northern Balkans. Theodora had been an entertainer at the Hippodrome. Nevertheless, they rose to the height of power and challenged the old Roman aristocracy as they set themselves up on the throne. With the Nika riots, rallied by the courage of his wife, or whatever, Justinian offered a conciliatory meeting to the rioters, met them, told them to meet him in the Hippodrome, had the doors closed, sent the army in, and 30,000 rioters were massacred, and that brought an end to the Nike rebellion. It also secured Justinian on the throne. Unfortunately, in the process, much of the heart of Constantinople had been burned, including the old cathedral, the predecessor of Hagia Sophia, the predecessor of Hagia Irene next door, the hospital between the two, the law courts across the street, the great Roman baths across the plaza, large portions of the great palace, and so on. So Justinian was poised here with the opportunity to rebuild the heart of the city of Constantine, in effect, as the city of Justinian, to rebuild the city in his own image. And one of the most important monuments in this is the triumphal column that he erected with a statue of himself on top of it, as the main street of the city leads into Hagia Sophia. And you see the Hippodrome next door, the site of the Great Massacre. Of course, Hagia Sophia, seen from the outside, is not nearly as impressive as Hagia Sophia seen from the inside. And this was the ultimate goal of the building, that is, to recreate an interior space that was unlike anything else in the world. Here we have a central dome rising 180 feet in the air above a space that's slightly greater than 100 feet wide, with an uninterrupted vault extending slightly more than 250 feet along the main axis of the building. This makes this the largest vaulted interior to survive from antiquity. And very clearly, the main feature in the design of the building is the great centrally positioned dome. A dome here that draws on the old Roman idea of the dome as the dome of heaven, that is, the dome as the dwelling place of the divinity, a dome that signifies sacred space. And in this, the dome really resembles more than anything else a canopy or ciborium, as you see in the small model here. A canopy like this, or ciborium, would appear above the altar in a church. It would appear above the throne of the emperor, or it would even appear above the display of holy relics. So the canopy like this signifies that everything that is underneath it is sacred space. And taking a piece of church furniture like the ciborium or canopy, blowing it up to architectural scale, as we see in Hagia Sophia, means that anything underneath the space of that dome is transformed. It becomes sacred space. And that means that any event that takes place inside Hagia Sophia is special. It is magnified, it is elevated, it is transported out of the realm of this world into a more celestial zone. Even modern events that take place under Hagia Sophia take on an added dimension, such as the meeting of world leaders. Here we have Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan meeting President Obama inside Hagia Sophia, a photograph taken about 10 years ago when Obama visited Istanbul and requested specially to visit Hagia Sophia. He, while visiting there, by the way, petted a cat in the building that has been famous ever since as the Obama cat, and has had a very privileged life because of the president's attention. In the photograph we see here meetings of heads of state, and the photographer here is very clever. You see that he uses the Ottoman mihrab to frame Erdogan, while Obama is staring off into space, marveling at the great dome up above and the image of the Mother of God in the conch of the apse. Now, that changed meaning of the interior of the building, where the addition of a dome and vaulting marks the interior as sacred space, changes the meaning of the traditional building, church building, the basilica, as we see, for example, here in a church in Thessaloniki. A basilica, traditionally covered by a wooden roof, would have, first of all, very different acoustics than a domed building, but its orientation is also different. The basilica is dominated by a longitudinal axis, an axis that leads us from the entrance of the church in the west to the sanctuary just before the apse in the east. Now, Hagia Sophia maintains that axial orientation in the plan of the building, but it adds to that a vertical axis. That is, the dome adds a centralizing focus to the building. So we really have two different axes in the building. One that focuses on the apse, the termination of the longitudinal axis, where the sanctuary was originally located, and the other that concentrates on the central performance space underneath the Great Dome. Now, the features of Hagia Sophia in its plan maintain those that we're familiar with from earlier basilicas. Compared here to the Church of St. John Studios in Constantinople, we have an atrium or courtyard as the access to the building, a narthex or entry vestibule leading us into the nave, the main performance space that is flanked by side aisles surmounted by galleries, and terminating in an apse that has the sanctuary immediately in front of us. Now, that basic plan is modified in several particular ways in Hagia Sophia. First, in coordinating the longitudinal plan with the centralizing element of the dome, we have columnar screens or exedri rounding out the corners of the building and help to modulate between the longitudinal plan and the centralized focus. The second, with the introduction of vaulting, is the necessity for a very different type of structural system. Vaulting is heavy. Brick, mortar, and stone weigh considerably more than wood. So if we have brick and mortar in the dome and vaults of the building, you need a much stronger system of foundations and supports than what one would have in a traditional basilica. What Anthemius and Isidorus do, and they had the title mechanikos, or architect engineer, is they introduce what we would call a system of point support. That is, while maintaining the features that we associate with the basilica, they are concentrating the weight of the vaulting at critical points around the building. So we have the four main piers underneath the dome as points where the loading is concentrated. And then these are connected to additional clusters of piers at the edge of the nave vessel. So loading here is concentrated at 12 critical points. And what this means is that the areas between those pier supports can be completely open. They can be taken out of the structural equation and they can become simply decorative curtain walls. And here we can see in the design of the building, the system of arches and vaults that is adjusting the thrust, the weight of the building to the piers, the pier support. What this does is the areas between the piers become open, spacious, and filled with light. Here, looking across the nave, we can see the openness of the side aisles and particularly of the outer walls of the building behind them. The typical opening in the wall of the building is, well, we have arches that are supported on piers, and underneath the arch, we have a curtain wall that is almost entirely given over to window. We have closure panels in the lower level, casement windows just above that, and then above that, we have glazing, so that the system is remarkably open. Now we have to realize that it is that arch that is the structural system, and everything underneath that arch is incidental to it. So we have, with the point support system, a great degree of openness that allows light to enter the building at multiple levels. The system of point support extends through all parts of the building. When we look at the dome as it comes down to us today, the original dome collapsed and was rebuilt in 563. I'll talk about this later, but the original dome was similar in detail to what we see now. That is, it was a ribbed dome with the thin construction of the dome of brick and mortar strengthened by ribs, kind of like an elevator. An umbrella is strengthened by its ribs. But this allows a ring of windows around the base of the building, 40 webs strengthening the dome with 40 windows opening around its base. That system of point support continues downward with 4 great arches over the nave, here, one to the east, one to the west, and additional arches to the north and south, supporting the dome with pendentives or spherical triangles added to help make that transition from the round plan of the dome to the square plan of the nave down below. The clerestory, in its form where we have the windows to the north and south, has been rebuilt from the 9th century onward, so we are uncertain about its original form. Except from the descriptions, we know it was considerably more open than it is now. So we have to imagine a much larger area of the clerestory given over to windows, and emphasizing even more dramatically how the point support system is working in the building. Okay, at this point, you're saying he's getting way too technical. I'm not understanding a thing. What is this pendentive? What is a a dome on pendentives. Well, let me get one more step into technical here and say, it seems from the descriptions, and most scholars would agree, the original dome of Hagia Sophia was lower and even more daring than the present dome. It was a pendentive dome, and while it had the ribs and the ring of windows around its base, it continued the curvature from the pendentives up through the crown of the vault, covering that central bay, which measured about 100 by 100 feet. In Byzantine measure, slightly larger than our modern feet, but 100 by 100 Byzantine feet, measuring off that central space. So the original dome, a pendentive dome, was transformed as it was rebuilt into a dome on pendentives. What are you talking about? Okay, let me explain in a way everyone can understand. And this is an experiment you can do over breakfast tomorrow morning. Okay, start with a grapefruit. A grapefruit is round. It's round in 3 dimensions. That means it is spherical. It is a sphere. If we cut the grapefruit in half, we are left with a hemisphere. Are you still with me? Okay. If we square off that hemisphere at the base, what we are left with is the configuration of a pendentive dome. That is, a dome that rises above a square base with the curvature continuous from the corners across the crown of the vault. And if we then cut off the top of the grapefruit, let's say the dome collapses, we're left with just what we see down here, and that remnant of the original surface of the grapefruit is the pendentive. And that is the remnant of the sphere that is at the beginning of the design of the Great Dome of Hagia Sophia. If we want to then add a dome above that, we have to change the geometry, which means we have to change our fruit selection. Go back to the refrigerator, get an orange, cut it in half, and you have your dome on pendentives here. The point of this is that the diameter of a grapefruit and the diameter of an orange are different, and that the geometry of the two between a dome on pendentives and the original pendentive dome are 2 different things. Why is this important? Well, here first you see diagrams that show the much lower form of the original dome and the form of the dome as reconstructed after the original dome collapsed following an earthquake in 557. So to make sense of all this, let's get all Pythagorean here for a minute. If we have a 100 by 100 foot square that defines the main bay of the building underneath the dome, the original dome is not going to be defined by the geometry of that square. It's going to be defined by the diagonal of that square. And you know from your Pythagorean theorem that the diagonal of a 100 by 100 foot square is going to be an irrational number. Now, the ancient Greeks and the Byzantines did not fully understand irrational numbers. They tended to round things out. And no architect, no matter how talented in the 6th century, would have begun the design of a great building like Hagia Sophia starting with an irrational number. He would have started, or they would have started, with a rational number. So how do we explain this discrepancy? And the best explanation that has been given, I think, is that explanation given by Volker Hofmann, who suggests that the design of Hagia Sophia's first dome is not just based on the 100-foot square, but there is an additional width to the nave, about 3 feet on either side, so that we actually have a double square The outer square here measuring 106 feet rather than 100 feet. And this, carried up to the level of the vaulting, would allow setbacks at the level of the vaulting. Why is this important? Well, if we move back to our Pythagorean theorem here, and we go to a 106-foot square, the diagonal of that is going to be 149.91 feet. That is close enough that the Byzantines would have counted it as 150 feet. What this means is that Anthemius and Isidorus did indeed begin with a round number. And they began with a very significant round number. For, well, what other great building from antiquity do we know had a dome diameter of 150 feet? That building, of course, is the Pantheon in Rome. 150 Roman feet, a slightly different measurement, but the numerical correspondence here, I think, is noteworthy. And I suspect what we're looking at here is part of Justinian's competitive discourse with the Roman past carried out in architectural form. Hagia Sophia, in this respect, can be seen as an improvement on the Pantheon. Well, after all, the Pantheon is heavy and closed on all sides. It's supported by thick walls, 25 feet thick at the base. And the structural system only allows one point of light to enter the building, the oculus at the crown of the dome. By contrast, Hagia Sophia, switching to different construction techniques and switching to a point support system, allows light to enter at multiple points in the elevation of the building. At least 6 different points in the elevation of the building have windows illuminating the building throughout. And as a consequence, rather than the heavy closed off forms of the Pantheon, we see in Hagia Sophia a space that is spacious, open, and light filled. In effect, Hagia Sophia does the Pantheon one better. The basic design of Hagia Sophia is fairly simple. If we look just at the nave vessel, we have the central domed square as the beginning of the design, extended by arches to the north or to the east and west by half domes, and then lower vaults bracing the half domes. That is, we've got a very sophisticated system of vaulting working along the main axis of the building. But the system does not extend along the transverse axis of the building. It does not extend into the side aisles and galleries. It affects only the nave vessel of the building. This is very clear when we look at the comparison of the longitudinal and transverse sections of the building. On the longitudinal axis, we've got that central dome braced by vaults to the east and west that cascade downward in a logical and structurally efficient way. On the transverse axis, we have, well, arches underneath the dome, and then we have clerestory windows. That is, there is nothing that is bracing the outward thrust of the dome at the critical points. That is, at where the arches meet the dome. So that transverse section does not work well structurally. What this results in is what we would call a lack of bilaterally symmetrical buttressing, a phrase I make my students memorize. That is, we've got a structural system that is flawed. It works well on the longitudinal axis, but not on the transverse axis. And this structural flaw in the building is exacerbated by several other features. One is what we know is the plastic flow of mortar. Now, the walls and the vaults of the building are built of brick laid with copious quantities of mortar. Mortar has, lime mortar has the particular quality of appearing solid when it has not yet set to its ultimate hardness. And with the quantities used in Hagia Sophia, it would have taken years for the mortar to set to its ultimate hardness. But as we know, Hagia Sophia was built in record time, from beginning to end in less than 6 years. A remarkable achievement even by today's construction standards. But what this meant in terms of the wall and vault construction is walls and vaults will appear solid even when they are not yet solid. And the mortar will deform as thrusts are exerted on it. This is also exacerbated by the great weight of the building. Hagia Sophia may appear light and airy and insubstantial, but it is in fact quite heavy. We know that the building was exerting 105 tons of pressure per square meter on its foundations, and that the individual bricks used in the construction of the building weigh about 20 pounds each. So this is a heavy building. And that deformation of the building is something that is evident in so many places in the interior of the building, perhaps most noticeably in the columns like this one here in the gallery, which are sort of leaning over sideways by the thrusts that have been exerted on it. Now, the critical point for supporting the dome would be the crown of each of the arches. East and west, we've got half domes. To the north and south, we just have a great arch here. And we've got these buttresses. One of the problems that structural engineers have toyed with looking at the building is, why are these buttresses where they are? They're really in the wrong place. If they were there to support the dome, they should be in the middle of the arch, bracing it at the critical point. They're not. They are at the corners of the domed bay. So are the buttresses here really misplaced in the design of the building? Well, one of the things that we have to realize is that, well, the building is huge. If we look at the diameter of the arches that support the dome, these are 100-foot in diameter. The arches that are open across to the east and west, and to the north and south would have been freestanding arches during the process of construction. These arches are larger than any surviving Roman arch in their diameter, and they would have weighed an extremely heavy amount. They would have pushed against the piers that support them at the bottom. In fact, the piers that support the arches here are leaning outward. They've rotated outward about half a meter off kilter on either side. And we have an account from Procopius, the historian of Justinian, who tells us that the arches exhibited structural problems even before the dome was begun. The eastern arch, which we're looking at here, was said to have been pushing against the piers and causing them to collapse, and the structure of the scaffolding underneath it having a great deal of difficulty supporting the arch until it was complete. Similar problems were visible in the arches over the clerestory zones. The columns in the clerestory zone were said to be crumbling from the weight of the arches on top of them. All of this is a structural deficiency noted before the dome was even begun. Now, as a consequence, as the construction continues in Hagia Sophia, the dome is being built over a building that is stretching sideways. And as a consequence, the base of the dome shifts from being round to being oval. So it's no wonder that after the earthquake of 557, the dome collapsed. And the architect responsible for the dome as we see it, Isidorus the Younger, the nephew of one of the original architects, built a more stable dome on a hemispherical design. And it's that dome that survives to this day. But the structural problems were never addressed throughout the history of a building. As a consequence, the western portion of the dome collapsed and was rebuilt in the 10th century. The eastern portion collapsed and was rebuilt in the 14th century. And the dome only stabilized in the 19th century when cable was wrapped around its base. Okay, so that's the structural system of the nave vessel and the various problems associated with it. One of the problems that architectural historians face looking at the building is how do we connect the design of that central vessel of the building with the secondary spaces around it? And various propositions have been made. Lots of gymnastics have been performed with compasses and rulers to try and find what is the guiding principle that connects the secondary spaces to the main space. My argument here is that they are designed as two separate systems. If we look, we can see, unlike the central vessel, which is based on a dome and half domes, the side aisles and galleries are based on groin vaults as the major structural evidence. And even where the two systems come together, well, they don't actually intersect. So here, looking in the gallery, there is my friend Eunice looking over the railing into the nave there. You see 6 green marble columns facing into the nave, but the structural system of the gallery here depends on 2 smaller columns in the foreground, the white columns that are supporting the arches and the groin vaults of the gallery structural system. And in between the two systems, we've got a pointless, sort of unnecessary barrel vault there that's sort of like an afterthought to connect the two systems together. This is even more awkward on the ground floor here, where you see columns of 2 different sizes. The larger ones facing into the nave, the smaller ones part of the structural system of the side aisles. And connecting between the two, we've got these very curious half arches here. And the vaults of the side aisles are often larger than those facing into the nave and overlap in very awkward ways. This is even more awkward when we turn to the area immediately behind the exedri of the building, where we can see awkward overlap of the arches, and we also see a rather unresolved design feature in the vaulting there. Now, I point out the awkwardness in these details and the lack of coordination between the side aisle and the gallery as a point of emphasizing that this is an experimental building on the largest of scales. And it is an experimental building for which the designers had the entire resources of an empire behind them. They had materials, they had workmen, they had all they needed to build a great church. What they didn't have was the time to work out all the details of the design. And I suspect in a project like this, they may have worked out the design of the nave vessel, and the secondary spaces are really a secondary concern. In fact, the point of the side aisles is to provide a beautiful view into the nave itself. So the design problems we see are part of the result of this being an experiment on the grandest of scales. Of course, in a Zoom lecture or even in a classroom lecture, it's impossible to give a sense of the scale that we're talking about here. And I like this view here taken about 20 years ago when there was scaffolding erected in the building for the repair of the mosaics in the dome. Scaffolding helps us to get a sense of scale. This scaffolding rises to the height of a 12 to 15 story building to bring the workers up to the level of the dome vaults. So that is like putting a small skyscraper inside Hagia Sophia. Now, my favorite adventure with this scaffolding was actually going to the top of it. Next to the stairs that you see running up through the middle, there was an open elevator that went all the way up to the top of the building. I don't normally get acrophobia, but at about the second cornice level, my knees started to give out. And as we approached the dome, the perspective of the dome changed completely. Could really see the history of the building as reflected in the sutures in the dome. Here, for example, is the suture between the 14th century rebuilding on the right and the 6th century portions on the left. But the real sense of scale came from turning around and looking down. Friends of mine did this, got back on the elevator and went back to the ground floor immediately. This was altogether terrifying. There was that sense, that interesting mixture of awe and terror coming together. Really began to understand the scale of the building from seeing it from this perspective. One of the things I did when I was up there was I walked around the nave cornice, which is probably the most scary thing I have ever done in my life, other than speak Greek in public. And I realized walking around the dome that the builders were just as terrified as I was. And one of the window reveals, I came across the mason's graffiti. And what we see here, scratched into the damp mortar in an area of 10th century repair, are prayers for the masons, saying, "Lord, protect your servant," and then giving their names, Pantaleon, Gregory, etc., all inscribing their prayers here in the mortar before all of this would be covered by mosaic. So they were, I assume, just as terrified by the scale of the building as I was. Now, it's great fun to talk about structure, engineering in Hagia Sophia. And a lot of the discussion of the building stops at that. But we have to think that engineering is never an end in itself. It is a means to an end. And the engineering in Hagia Sophia that is such a marvel to us is there for the ultimate effect of the interior aesthetics. That is, to create that transcendental, dematerialized, ethereal impression of the interior space, something that has been commented on repeatedly from the 6th century. I show a few quotes by Procopius here, who talks about the light in the building seeming to emanate from within rather than from without, and how the structure of the building is altogether terrifying, seeming to, the dome seems to float in the air on no firm basis, to the peril of those inside. He concludes, by the way, that he can't explain the structure of the building and concludes that the dome is supported by a golden chain from heaven. It's a great engineering feat if you can somehow manage to suspend your building from heaven. And he talks about the building in the language of the Old Testament, that is, the language of the Temple of Solomon. He says, this is a place where God would love to dwell. That is, Hagia Sophia is the new Temple of Solomon. Constantinople is the new Jerusalem, and the Byzantines are the new chosen people. That sense of the transcendental in the interior of the building as heaven on earth is something that is intentionally contrived through the architecture. Now, I've talked about the structure, but the aesthetic effect of the interior is to dematerialize that structure. That is, to visually subvert the structural so that we're simply not aware of it. And this is done in a variety of remarkable ways. So looking across the nave here, we can see that the nave arcade has 4 columns. The gallery arcade above it has 6. That means that they are not vertically aligned. The gallery columns do not rest directly above those below. So the structural clarity here of the column as a structural element or an indicator of structure has been subverted. This is even more clear when we turn to the exedra at the corner of the building. Here you see 2 columns down below and 6 columns up above. Now this is going against everything that you would be taught in Roman architecture. Structural is to be emphasized visually. It's not to be undermined. This is something that was aware to the 6th century viewers. So Paul the Silentiary, who wrote a sermon for the rededication of the building in 563, comments looking at this corner detail, one may wonder at the resolve of the man who upon 2 columns has bravely set thrice 2 and has not hesitated to fix their bases over empty air. I like how he puts this. You know, it really is subverting the structural if you're suspending their bases over empty air. This is even more clear when we turn to the decorative elements of the revetments and the surfaces of the building, many of them elaborately detailed and heavily undercut. Most obvious are the columns of the building. The basket forms of the columns with the acanthus leaf patterns heavily undercut so that they no longer look like marble. They look like lace. They look like something your great Aunt Bertha might have crocheted. They don't look like something that should be strong enough to support the arches rising above them. This is part of that dematerialization of visual subversion of the structure. By the way, there are hundreds of these in the building, and they all are decorated with the monograms, roundels you see here, the letters of the name Justinian, the letters of his title Basileus or Emperor, the letters of the name Theodora, the letters of her title Augusta there. And that dematerialization is something that continues in the colorful patterns of the marbles that sheathe the lower portion of the building. Marbles of many different points of origin and many different colors. And here we have Great Aunt Bertha at work again, crocheting the borders that link those panels of marble together. So here, even on the major piers of the building, the marble panels become part of this dematerialization of the structure. The marbles are important in another way because of their points of origin. This is something that Paul the Silentiary tells us about in that dedicatory sermon I mentioned earlier. Here he describes the marbles in great detail and tells us their point of origin, beginning dramatically, who even in the thundering strains of Homer shall sing the marble meadows gathered upon the mighty walls and spreading pavement of the lofty church. As you follow his account here, what you get are descriptions of the marble combined with their point of origin. The green flanks of Charistus, speckled Phrygian stone, porphyry stone from the Nile, green stone of Laconia, stone from Yasin peaks, from the Lydian headland, from the land of the Lydian sun, from the Moorish hills, Celtic crags, and the land of Atrax. Now, what he is giving us in his elaborate description of the marbles here is a geography lesson. He is laying out for us the empire of Justinian in all its extent and all of its riches. The marbles here represent the dominion of Justinian. And if we move from the nave into the side aisles, where we see so many of the original mosaics preserved, we see the original mosaics, none of them are figural. They're all abstract patterns. And as one recent study has noted, the patterns that appear here are patterns that derive from Persian silks. That is, they derive from the richest and costliest of materials available in the empire of Justinian. And all of this rising above a floor of Proconnesian marble with its gray and white veining, opened up in book-matched panels so that they appear like rippling water underneath our feet. We are, in the words of Barry Flood, Fabio Barry, walking on water in the floor of Hagia Sophia. Taken together, we have a building that is altogether miraculous. We have the vault of heaven, the abode of the divinity, rising over the heavenly dominion of Justinian, swathed in the luxury of the east, above a floor that is turning liquid below our feet. It is no wonder that the Byzantines and every other visitor to Hagia Sophia historically has seen the building as something special, as heaven on earth. Perhaps most famously, the Russian ambassador from Kiev, who came when Vladimir of Kiev was looking for a good religion for his people. His ambassadors were taken to the liturgy in Hagia Sophia, and their minds were blown. They wrote, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. We only knew that God dwells there among men. We cannot forget that beauty." And it's on this basis of their impression of Hagia Sophia that Russia converted to Orthodox Christianity. It's a rare political event where we can trace such a monumental occurrence to the impression of a work of architecture. And that impression of the miraculous is something that we have to attribute to the architecture. If we think about it, Hagia Sophia is a concept, not a person. There's not a saint behind the dedication of this building. There is the holy wisdom of God. And the dedication, there were no important relics in the building. The building was not a commemorative structure. Nothing important happened on this site before the construction of Hagia Sophia. It is on the basis of its architecture that Hagia Sophia has become sacred space. That we see here, the best example I know of the construction of sanctity using architecture to create a sense of sacred presence. Of course, the architecture does this as it is activated, the space is activated by ceremony. And one of the great thought experiments we have to engage in with Hagia Sophia is putting the people back in and putting the building back into its original use. We realize in the 6th century that there were several hundred people responsible for the oversight of the building, including 100 doorkeepers. The daily maintenance of Hagia Sophia through the Byzantine Empire was a source of great concern and required regular donations from the emperor. Liturgy, the celebration of the worship service inside this building, because of its great scale, would be slowed and monumentalized within that space. And it would take on different dimensions because the emperor was present in many of the ceremonies. By the 10th century, there were at least 19 annual ceremonies in which the emperor and his retinue were required to participate. So we have the emperor and the church coming together in this building. One of the recent experiments to try and understand the liturgy in Hagia Sophia is the Icons of Sound project from Stanford University, where acoustical tests were done to measure the acoustical properties of the interior of Hagia Sophia, and then apply the singing of the liturgy here carried out by the Capella Romana to the acoustical dimensions of the interior of Hagia Sophia. And this really helps give us a sense of how that space is activated. Let me play a little bit of this and say a few words about it. I'll play a little bit more, and you can find this very easily on YouTube or on CD. But what's important here is the quality of that sound. Hagia Sophia is a resonating vessel. As we move from wooden roof basilicas to vaulted church interiors, we see a concomitant change in the worship service. That is, moving from privileging the spoken word to privileging chant and singing as conducting the message of the building. With the singing as we hear it, with the Capella Romana, what I want to point out is this is a very lively acoustical interior. There is a lot of ambient noise and there is a lot of reverberation. The reverberation can extend for as long as 12 seconds. So that means that the choir is singing against the reverberation, that is the echo of their singing as it resounds around the building. So the space fills up with sound. And in one aspect, we can see that as filling the vessel of the church with sanctity. At the same time, when we listen to the quality of the singing here, what we hear is a lot of background noise. There is what sounds at some points like a drum roll behind the choir as they're singing, so that the singing becomes muddy. And the sung word loses its specificity. It's hard to pick out particular words, but what we hear is sacred sound that becomes an abstract presence inside the building. So let me play just a little bit more. To bring out, I wish I could play more, but time's a wasting. One of the significance of this project is it is using new technologies that were not available 15, 20 years ago, and a project that was only possible with complete access to the building. This is one of my concerns as we move forward in time with Hagia Sophia. What happens next? And this is a matter of concern, not just among scholars and visitors, but thinking in terms of if this building is a historic monument, if it is a museum that is a repository of human history, what is the story that is being told? Now, as a part of its human rights policy, UNESCO has attempted to define both the tangible and intangible cultural heritage of humanity deemed worthy of protection. But with a monument as significantly loaded as Hagia Sophia, there's always a danger of accepting a majority narrative that would silence all other histories. Nationalist or religious or other selective readings of cultural heritage can effectively erase historical memory and sever links with the past. And one wonders if this may be the subtext of the current agenda. But as a monument on the world stage, Hagia Sophia has become a repository of many collective memories. And it should be allowed to maintain multiple meanings and to resonate with multiple narratives and multiple histories for its many diverse audiences. So as the sun sets over our fair city and we bid a fond adieu to Hagia Sophia, we hope we will be able to see each other in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ousterhout, for a fantastic lecture. Would you be willing to take some questions?
Sure.
So Curtis Adams asks, was the architectural inspiration for the Hagia Sophia based on new conceptions of line, shape, form, and color?
I think that's probably a yes. We have a number of buildings that introduce vaulting. We have a number of buildings that have played with geometry in their design or have worked with using numerical ratios. Nothing on the scale of Hagia Sophia. So while there are some precedent for that, that's certainly what we have here. And very clearly, Anthemius and Isidorus were charged with doing something completely original, to do something that would redefine Justinian's empire in architectural terms.
Great, thank you. Alan Langdale wants to know, now that the conversion has taken place, are tourists able to see the mosaics of the upper galleries?
The upper gallery is presently closed off. And the mosaics visible on the ground floor have all had curtains added in front of them. I don't know what the long-term prognosis for visiting the building is. Right now, we're still in the COVID era, so visiting Istanbul is not something that I'm going to be doing anytime soon, sad to say.
Thank you very much. Joseph Kopta, who's joining us from Munich, asks what he describes as a very pedestrian question, which I don't actually think is all that pedestrian. Why a double narthex at Hagia Sophia? Are there precedents for this?
I think probably it may be simply the scale of the building as we see everything built up in scale. I don't know if there was a special liturgical function to having a separate outer narthex. As we see in later Byzantine architecture, the minor spaces become much more complicated. But here, I think it's simply a matter of the scale of the building.
I've always experienced that outer narthex as part of the kind of mind-blowing experience of entering the building, where you go into it and it seems like a huge space. And then you go into the next one and you say, oh, this is a really huge space. And then of course you walk into the, anyway. But so Daniel Stern says, it sounds like the procession one encounters of the Orthodox Byzantine priests who dressed in black robes and carry very big crosses on their chests, who chant in the old city of Jerusalem. I wonder if there is a connection.
Yes. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so it's the same people, basically, the same tradition. An anonymous attendee asks, the platform at the end of the apse seems off center. Is that on purpose, or is there a story behind it? I think there's a story behind it, Bob.
Yeah, sadly, we have, in addition to having lost acres of gold mosaic from the vault of the building, we have also lost the original liturgical furnishings. So the sanctuary of the Byzantine Church has been entirely removed. And what we see there are elements that were put in during the Ottoman era for Islamic worship. So the elements that are off center are there to redirect our prayers from east to east-southeast so that the faithful will be praying in the direction of Mecca. So all of this is something we see in converted churches as part of that process of reorienting the design of the building to give us a focus toward Mecca.
Great, thank you very much. Barbara Haghulo asks, the Virgin Mary is the throne of wisdom in the Middle Ages, and the Pantheon was Santa Maria ad Martyras. Was there ever a Marian symbolism in the dome of the Hagia Sophia?
Well, there were the city, of course, was under the protection of the Virgin Mary, and we see, or we used to be able to see at the entrance to the building, the great mosaic that shows Justinian and Constantine presenting the church and the city to the Virgin Mary. And it's come out in recent studies that the image that we see of the Mother of God, the Virgin Mary, in the apse of the building was one of the famous revered images of the Virgin from Constantinople that is replicated at a number of other locations. And it is in fact replicated at the Constantine and Justinian mosaic as well. So there seems to be a special association with the Virgin as she is represented in the apse of Hagia Sophia. In the dome of Hagia Sophia, after the 9th century, it seems there was an image of Christ Pantocrator at the crown of the vault.
Thank you. Gregory Bloomquist asks, how do you compare the architectural developments here and the developments soon after in Visigoth and Romanesque art in the West?
Well, first of all, in scale, there is no comparison. If you look at Visigothic architecture and first Romanesque architecture, it's very, very small. The vaults are heavy, and it relies primarily on thick walls to support the vaults. So there's nothing of the structural sophistication or structural daring that we see in Hagia Sophia and those buildings. This is something that in the West really only begins to be achieved in the 12th century as we shift from what we would call the Romanesque style into the Gothic style. And we see the introduction of more sophisticated structural system and larger buildings.
Great, thank you. Julia Pace or Pace, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, Julie. Would Professor Ousterhout comment on the pronunciation of Hagia Sophia and why he chooses to pronounce the G when the Turkish pronunciation is Aya?
You say tomato, I say tomato. One of the great parlor games among the British is to say there are 9 correct pronunciations of the word Byzantine. You can figure them out. So I say Hagia Sophia to make it clear to English speakers. Hagia Sophia would be how it would be in Greek, Hagia Sophia in Turkish. It's all the same.
Thank you. Let's see. Geoffrey Nathan asks, what would have been the impetus for so much architectural innovation, and innovations in quotation marks here? Would the successes with increasingly complex structures, for example, St. Polyeuctos, would that have given the architects the courage to try something so new?
This is an interesting question. And I think it all goes back to this idea of Justinian's competitive discourse with the Roman past. Now, the Roman emperors of the 1st and 2nd century used architecture as part of their propaganda message, if we can call it that. We remember Trajan through the construction of his forum, for example. We remember Hadrian through his villa, or perhaps the Pantheon. We remember earlier emperors through the construction of great palaces and so on. These became symbols of their reign. And Cassiodorus, a writer in the 6th century, says, in effect, the house represents its occupant. So using architecture in the same innovative way as his Roman predecessors used architecture, Justinian is really putting himself on his map, on the map. And one would wonder if without his great building program, would we remember him as fondly today as we do?
Indeed, and an anonymous attendee wants to know if there were later domes influenced by Hagia Sophia, acknowledging that you've mentioned the influence of the Pantheon on Hagia Sophia itself, and a suggestion for a later dome that was influenced by the Hagia Sophia is Brunelleschi's dome. So that would be the one in Florence?
Yes.
Right, okay.
Okay, I think what we see with the construction of Hagia Sophia is this is a part of a larger historical discourse. And Justinian, in a number of his buildings, is looking back to Roman imperial architecture as a model. In his Church of St. Sergius and Bacchus, for example, we can see the dome reflecting the kinds of domes that were constructed under the Emperor Hadrian. With the construction of Hagia Sophia, one of the immediate responses to it is Khosrow, the Sasanian king, builds his palace at Ctesiphon with one of the greatest vaults known in Sasanian or Eastern architecture at that time that is done immediately after the construction of Hagia Sophia. And this is Justinian's greatest rival. And so he's really building a monument to set himself on an equal as a builder like Justinian. And this is carried on probably the most visibly in Ottoman architecture, as the Ottoman domed mosque becomes modeled on the Mosque of Hagia Sophia. And we see architects like Sinan increasing the scale of their mosque in response specifically to Hagia Sophia. With the Selimiye Jami in Edirne in the 16th century, the architect Sinan equals the diameter of Hagia Sophia. And according to his autobiography, says he has done that under the challenge of Western European builders who were saying basically, see if you can do better than that. With Brunelleschi's dome, I think that there are a number of potential influences or that we can see picked up in early Renaissance architecture, but the design of Brunelleschi's dome is something entirely original. It certainly competes in scale with the dome of Hagia Sophia, being considerably taller than Hagia Sophia. But the structural design is something else entirely, and this is very much the design of Brunelleschi rather than something that he's copying or learning from a Byzantine model.
Thank you, interesting. James Shriver would like to know if you see connections with your work on the Holy Sepulchre. So here's somebody who knows your work. In terms of the strange connections or connects, he wrote, or lack thereof, between different parts of the building.
Now, I've written an article about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where I talk about the Crusader rebuilding of the church, in which they are attempting to leave as much as possible of the original sacred structure intact. And what this results in is remarkable disjunctions and a really, really weird building. And this at the Holy Sepulchre is the result of the historical process. At Hagia Sophia, there is nothing to impede the architects. There is virtually no trace of the older Church of Hagia Sophia there that is incorporated into the new. Maybe a few spolia here and there, but that's it. The design is something new entirely. And the disjunctions I'm talking about in the design here are part of that design process, and a design process that happened very, very quickly. Now, the Nikkei riots happened in 532, and even before the ashes had settled over the first Hagia Sophia, it seems Anthemius and Anthemius and Isidorus were off and running, designing the new building, which is dedicated 5 years and 11 months later. This is just a phenomenal feat. And if you think about the time scale for a Gothic cathedral, the Cathedral of Reims was built in just about a century, and that's one of the most rapid of the construction process projects of the Gothic era. So having a building that is larger than that, and more spacious than that, and more structurally daring than that, built in less than 6 years is absolutely phenomenal. But for me, it points out that Anthemius and Isidorus simply didn't have the time in their design process to work out all the details. And I suspect some of the design details were still being worked out as the building was being constructed.
Thank you. Was one narthex for the imperial entourage from the palace and the other for the people, in quotation marks, each entering from a different cardinal direction? Asks Alan Langdale.
I don't think so. The main imperial entrance would have been a bridge opening from the palace onto the gallery level. So where the imperial mosaics are today in the gallery level. In between them, there is a door, and that door seems to have originally connected to a bridge. So the emperor, unless he is participating in the procession, would enter privately directly from the palace without going down to the ground level and amid the people.
Thank you. Michelle Mandarino has recently read Tom Matthews' The Early Churches of Constantinople, and notes that he describes the architecture of the reconstruction as, quote, refined and more feminine, unquote, than the earlier Byzantine architecture. Would you agree with this sentiment? And if so, why might this change have happened?
Refined, perhaps. I'm hesitant to call it feminine. Perhaps the dedication is female, maybe that's it. But there is a structural innovation. There's a structural originality in the design of Hagia Sophia that we simply don't see in any of the earlier buildings. So what we're seeing here is something that is new. It is refined. I don't think it's particularly feminine, but hey.
Let's see. How different was the Hagia Sophia prior to the addition of the Ottoman additions?
Well, one of the things we see with Hagia Sophia is this is a building that is constructed in an earthquake zone. Istanbul is plagued regularly through its history by major earthquakes. I was there for the most recent one in 1999, or one of the most recent ones in 1999. And the only damage in Hagia Sophia at that time was where the scaffolding came loose and hit the plaster on the wall and made a dent in the plaster on the wall. Otherwise, the building was fine. My Turkish colleagues who were working on the restoration were back at work the day after the earthquake. So it was standing fast. But the fact that it's on earthquake territory means that when you go to repair a building that has been damaged, you're always a bit more cautious. Friends who were recently in a wreck on the freeway, and their response to it was to buy a larger car. This is, we increase the safety factor when accidents happen. So with Hagia Sophia, that means not replicating the original daring structural form of the building, but as with Anthemius or Isidorus the Younger, doing a more secure dome with a higher profile, or in the 9th century, filling in the windows in the clear story zone so that you have a more solid wall there, or adding buttresses around the building on all sides, including the great Gothic style flying buttresses across the west facade of the building. So a lot of the additions that are modifications that we see are additions or modifications that were there because of the structural deficiencies in the original design of the building, not something that has changed as function changed. In fact, when Hagia Sophia was converted to a mosque, it was left pretty much as is. The mosaics were visible up through the 18th century. And part of that was intentional, that the message of Hagia Sophia converted to a mosque was, this was a church and it is no more. It is now a mosque. And preserving the elements that identify it as a church were very important to the message of the building in those early centuries. Today, and well, after the 18th century, considerably less so. So after we see the constructions of many, many Ottoman mosques that look like Hagia Sophia, the attitude now is, well, Hagia Sophia looks like a mosque. So it should be a mosque because it looks like a mosque, but it looks like a mosque because the mosques are copying it, not vice versa.
Thank you. I'm going to combine a couple questions and We don't have time to read all of them because we can't keep you here all night. Bob, you've already been speaking for such a long time, but Jacqueline Jung asks if there is any room or need for an iconostasis in a church this huge.
Thank you, Jackie. And we know the basis of that question now, don't we? The original templon or sanctuary enclosure of Hagia Sophia was transparent. We have a low barrier with an open screen above that. And what we would call an iconostasis is something that is a much later invention. It's only by sometime around the 12th century or later that we see icons introduced that close off the screen and turn it from something that is transparent into something that is opaque, where the icons become part of that barrier, a visual barrier between us and what lies beyond. But through much of its Byzantine history, one would be able to have that vision into the sanctuary because the screen was relatively open.
Thank you. Alexander Bray, another familiar name, says you emphasize Justinian's desire to rival the earlier monuments of Rome. And in here, I'm going to interject a question someone else asked, would they have known the Pantheon? So Rome. But you also mentioned references to Solomon's temple in the early reception of the building. Do sources suggest a Justinianic rivalry there as well, or a different type of relationship with biblical precedents?
Well, we know that Byzantine imperial ideology is based very much on Old Testament precedents. There's a wonderful discussion of this by Gilbert d'Agrand in his book, Emperor and Priest, where there are Solomonic or Old Testament underpinnings to a lot of the Byzantine ideology. And this is something that I think fits very well with the architecture of Justinian. He's not replicating the Temple of Solomon by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, you know, it was destroyed. We don't know what it looked like. We have the biblical references to it. But the Temple of Solomon becomes a convenient shorthand for sacred space. So to describe a building as sacred, to emphasize its sanctity by using the language of the temple to describe it, helps us to understand the sacred nature of the building. So there's a relationship there with Solomon, but as an imperial builder, Justinian is very much working into this idea that he is a leader like the great leaders of the Old Testament. With the monuments of Rome, we know that Rome was very much on the mind of Justinian, and it is actually during the process of the construction of Hagia Sophia that the Byzantine army begins its reconquest of Italy. We also have reflections of this in Ravenna at the same time, but I suspect that Anthemius and Isidorus are more important here in the transfer of knowledge than Justinian. Justinian probably didn't know the Pantheon, but I suspect that Anthemius and Isidorus knew of the Pantheon in one way or another.
And I'm going to leave Kaylin Jewell with our last question, and I apologize to the people who framed questions that I haven't been able to answer. Perhaps you can follow up with Professor Ousterhout via email. But Kaylin says, I'd love it if you'd talk a little bit about the history of the building's 6th century baptismal font.
Well, there was a, well, that wasn't really part of what I was going to talk about, but there is a baptistry attached to the 6th century building, and the baptismal font is still there. It was actually pulled out of the building when that the baptistry was converted in to a sultanic mausoleum. So there are now cenotaphs of the early sultans inside what used to be the Byzantine baptistry. And in the entryway of the baptistry now, there is an enormous baptismal font sitting there. And so you can get the total immersive experience of what it would be like to go into a baptismal font in the Byzantine period there. I don't know what else you want me to say about Kaylin, but there is a baptismal font there. Okay.
Thank you very, very much. And so I trust that we will hear the reverberations of much applause from our silent attendees. Profound thanks to you, Bob. I wish we could take you out to dinner right now, but we'll just have
What,
to.
you're not taking me out to dinner?
We'll have to give you a rain check for that. Thank you again, and thanks to everyone who attended and to everyone who will be viewing this in the future. Very best wishes.
And thanks all of you. This was fun.
Great.